What is a social contract? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. What is a social contract? So a social contract, the idea of it first entered the consciousness in the 1600s. Most people credit Rousseau for coining the term and bringing the concept into the world. Essentially, a social contract is the idea that there's an agreed upon set of circumstances, limits, a contract between a population that is giving its consent to be governed to a person or a body of people. And the idea of the social contract, to begin thinking about it, traditionally, the idea is to imagine humans living outside of any sort of system, just in nature. And the idea at the time, at least the argument for social contracts, was that when people live in nature and there's no law governing them, that essentially humanity is always in a state of war or violence. Nothing constrains their immoral activity. In short, there's no governance. And that people just will murder, rape, kill, and never suffer any consequence for immoral action, and essentially that humans would be in a perpetual state of anarchy with no system of justice, maybe not even a sense of justice at all. Just sort of going around nearly being dumb, violent animals with no regard to law, order, justice, any of that. And the idea is that a social contract transmutes humanity from a state of violent anarchy into a state / sociological unit / society of law and order, where there's a sense of justice for the individuals who comprise the community writ large. So that's the idea of a social contract, is that it transforms humanity from savages into civilized beings. And when we look at this, so philosophically, it's tough to say with certainty exactly how all different groups of humans would act without laws and without social contract. But historically, we do know that they were essentially roaming bands of psychopaths and sociopaths who did constantly war on each other and who didn't really seem to have any long-term sense of collective good or the rights of the individual. In fact, if we were to take a Jungian look, there wasn't a tremendous amount of individuation occurring. Not to say that it wasn't occurring, but the individual was not the focus. In the pre-social contract and pre-society analysis, humans were really engaged in collective survivalism. So the individual experience was not at the forefront of the group or even whoever the organic leaders of the sociological units were. They were just leading more through force of will and absolute power and survivalism and a collectivist mindset. And then the idea is that if we look, there's a progression from that into civilizations that don't necessarily have social contracts. They just have sort of more codified versions of might makes right. You get these chieftains, you get monarchs, you get warlords, but really the central theme for positions of leadership and how societies are structured from hunter-gatherer up until the idea of social contract is really just basically might makes right. And sociological units are formed around that. And then the nature of power, because the nature of power is so varied, because power can be contributed to by economic power, threats of violence, manipulation. It can be anything but like a sense of justice. Like the historical tales that there are plenty of historical tales, but the historical tales that speak fondly of monarchs and rulers do so because they are the rare instances where a despot with no social contract was actually attempting, or even in reality exercising, being a facilitator of actual justice to some degree. Probably not to any great degree, because probably most ascents to the throne have been, bloody, fraught with political issues. So after having ran through and being subjected to monarchs and despots and tyrants and aristocrats and all these things that were operating with no real codified consent from the governed, this idea of social contract came out of, hey, this is basically a collective bargaining agreement. The masses are here, and at this point, the masses were no longer allowed to go back to hunting and gathering at this point in human history. When the social contract theory came up, it was, well, now that we're stuck in these power structures, let's have a bit of a collective bargaining agreement, and let's explicitly state what our rights are under this artificial system. Because any system of human governance is an artificial system. Even if it evolves organically, it's still a put upon system that the humans in the system have to agree on, essentially using their imagination. You have to envision these laws, even if some of them, like when we talk about justice and we get into justice, justice is an intangible thing, being morality, a state of being in moral properness, being made tangible in terms of justice, to be able to use the energy and resources of the apparatus to put the states of the individual in the system into a position of moral correctness in relation to the resources and power and ability of the apparatuses to distribute justice. But up until social contract theory, there was no agreement between the governed and the governors, whatever system they happen to be in charge of, whatever the nature of the political system, doesn't really matter. But there hadn't been an actual collective bargaining agreement, so to say, where the people elucidated their rights. Because when you take them out of nature, where they have full rights to do right and wrong, and then you put them in a system that starts defining what they can do and limiting what they can do, very much limiting what they can do, especially before social contract theory, they said, well, let's articulate these things, put them down in writing, say what the things are we actually consent to, the certain agreements that we have before we empower the government and give them a mandate to do all these things. And then you go from there. Now, the prime example of social contract theory would be the U.S. Constitution, because the Constitution was put together in the 1700s, and so the founding fathers, the thinkers of the American Constitution, they'd had a chance to be exposed to social contract theory, and they were explicitly writing one. So in that example, they put out all the explicit rights of the citizenry, of the individual. None of them are group rights. They're all individual rights that every citizen who is born into that system is guaranteed, that they agree to. By being born into it, they're tacitly agreeing to it. And then there are other levels of the system, if you engage further, where you can take oaths of office and other mechanisms for more consciously reaffirming your agreement with that social contract. In that case, the social contract being the U.S. Constitution. And you can know what your rights are. And in that sense, that's your actual relationship with the government, because the government always changes out. The elected officials have turnover, there's different people. The government is, in terms of social contract theory, supposed to be there to facilitate the social contract that's previously been agreed upon between people in the governing offices and people in the population who are to be governed. And when government's in breach of those, in breach of that contract, then they lose their mandate. They have broken the contract, and they're no longer a legitimate government, because the reason in social contract theory that the government gets to peaceably govern the population is that both parties are agreeing and adhering to the social contract. And in this case, the social contract being codified version of what the explicit rights of the individual are and what the expectations are of the government to facilitate those rights. So it's all out in the open. So in the issue of transparency, which is important because when we analyze the other portions of government and realize that the governmental institution's number one currency is justice, which is the ability to put people, the individual, in a state of moral correctness, then we know that the social contract is the only guiding document. It's the only guiding source document for which all of the mandates, all of the legislations, all of the actions of government, whoever happens to be in the government, which is just a rotating office job, are. It is their express duty to facilitate everything in the social contract that's been agreed upon. And there's no allowance for varying or veering off of it. And when they do, then they become an illegitimate government. And you can vote them out or do whatever and replace them with people who honor the social contract as it's explicitly written out. Now, knowing that we live in an era that has a well-established social contract, not just in the United States, but in other countries, that's what a constitution is. The Constitution lays out the social contract. We can look backwards and see what a crazy embarrassment basically monarchs are, or other forms of rule where there's no discussion of what the actual rights of the individual are. A society only exists to facilitate the rights of the individuals and be mindful of the quality of life of the individual, and to also understand what the level of justice is for the individual, of having them in a state of moral correctness. That is the responsibility, the explicit responsibility of the government, and the social contract puts it in black and white. So they know what to do and we know what to expect. So social contract, incredibly important, maybe the most important organic agreement and understanding of humanity within itself, reaching an explicit understanding of how human sociological units want to govern themselves, so that there's understanding between the individuals and the group. And when those things are aligned and in focus, then we have civilization. So social contract's pretty important. Well, I hope you found this helpful. Thanks for spending some time here at Philosopher's Corner, and I hope you have fun.